Did you know a teenage girl once led an entire army to victory when seasoned generals had failed for years? Picture an empress, who some say started as an actress, staring down a furious mob and saving an empire with her words. Think about a nun who not only talked to God, but also advised kings and the Pope, wrote Gauquest books, and even composed music that still played today. One queen actually inherited her kingdom, then had to fight her own husband to keep it. And get this, some medieval women weren't just at home. They were running businesses, brewing beer, and even making enough money to be taxpayers. Number 9. The peasant girl who commanded an army and became a saint. Her name was Joan, or Jehan as they'd say back then, and she was born around 1412 in a little village in France called Domrémy. This was a tough time. France was deep into a conflict with England that later got called the 100 Years' War. It felt like it would never end, and France was mostly losing. The English and their allies, the Burgundians, controlled a huge chunk of the country, including Paris. The French heir to the throne, Charles, was stuck, uncrowned, and a bit hopeless. Joan said that when she was about 13, she started hearing voices. Not just any voices, but those of saints, Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. They told her she had a special mission from God. This mission was a big one: drive the English out of France and get Charles crowned king in Reims, the traditional coronation city. So, at just 16 or 17, Joan set off. She convinced a local commander, Robert de Baudricourt, to give her an escort to see Charles at his court in Chinon. This was no small feat. She had to travel through dangerous enemy-held territory. She cut her hair short and dressed in men's clothes for the journey, which was a practical choice, but also something that would later be used against her. When she finally got to Chinon in 1429, Charles was understandably a bit skeptical. A teenage peasant girl claiming divine guidance, but Joan was persistent, and by many accounts, incredibly peanut. She supposedly identified Charles even when he was disguised among his courtiers. She spoke to him privately, and whatever she said convinced him, or at least made him willing to take a chance. He had her examined by theologians at Poitiers to make sure she wasn't a heretic or a fake. They gave her the thumbs up, or at least found nothing wrong with her. Charles decided to give her a shot. He provided her with a suit of white armor, a banner, and, amazingly, command of troops. Her first major task was to relieve the city of Orléans, which had been besieged by the English for months and was on the verge of falling. This would have been a massive blow to the French. Joan arrived at Orléans in late April 1429. Her presence was like an electric shock to the demoralized French soldiers. She wasn't a traditional military strategist, but she led from the front, inspiring incredible bravery. Within days of her arrival, the French launched a series of attacks. Joan was even wounded by an arrow, but reportedly pulled it out herself and returned to the fight. On May 8th, the English abandoned the siege. It was a stunning victory. After Orléans, Joan's reputation soared. She led the French army in a series of swift victories in the Loire's valley, clearing the way to Reims. towns like Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency fell, and the English army suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Patay. These victories were critical. With the path clear, Charles, accompanied by Joan, marched to Reims. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII was crowned King of France in Reims Cathedral. Joan stood beside him, her banner in hand. She had accomplished a huge part of her mission. But her story doesn't end there. Joan wanted to push on and retake Paris. An attempt to liberate Paris in September 1429 failed, and Joan was wounded again. The royal court started to waver, and some advisors favored negotiating with the Burgundians. In May 1430, during a skirmish outside the town of Compiègne, Joan was captured by Burgundian soldiers. The Burgundians sold her to the English. The English were determined to discredit her, and, by extension, King Charles VII, whose coronation she had made possible. They put her on trial for heresy and witchcraft in Rouen, a city under English control. The trial, led by pro-English clergy like Bishop Pierre Cauchon, was politically motivated. Joan, uneducated but incredibly sharp, defended herself bravely for months against complex theological questions. She was accused of many things, including heresy, for her visions and for wearing men's clothing. In May 1431, under immense pressure and possibly after a threat of torture, she signed a document abjuring her claims and promising to wear women's clothes. However, a few days later, she was found in men's clothing again. Some accounts say she was tricked or forced. This relapse was seen as proof of her continued heresy. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She was only about 19 years old. She asked for a cross to be held before her as she died. Years later, after the war had turned decisively in France's favor, partly thanks to the momentum Joan had created, King Charles VII ordered a new investigation into her trial. In 1456, a posthumous retrial declared her innocent and condemned the original verdict. Joan of Arc became a symbol of French unity and resistance. Much later, in 1920, she was officially canonized as a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. Her rise from an unknown village girl to a national heroine who changed the course of a war was truly extraordinary. Number 8. The Queen who united a kingdom and funded a world-changing voyage. Isabella, the First of Castile, was born in 1451 in a place called Madrigal de las Altas Torres, which sounds pretty grand. Her early life wasn't super easy. Her father, King John II of Castile, died when she was just 3. Her older half-brother, Henry IV, became king, and Isabella, her younger brother Alfonso, and her mother were kind of pushed to the side, living in relative obscurity for a while. Things got complicated in Castile. Many nobles weren't happy with Henry IV's rule. They even declared Isabella's younger brother Alfonso as a rival king. But Alfonso died young in 1468. Suddenly, the rebellious nobles looked to Isabella. Henry IV wanted Isabella to marry someone he chose, like the King of Portugal. Isabella had other ideas. She made a bold move. Against her brother's wishes, she secretly married Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Aragon, in 1469. She was 18, he was 17. This was a huge political gamble. Castile and Aragon were the two largest kingdoms in what we now call Spain. Their marriage was a step towards uniting these realms. When Henry IV died in 1474, Isabella declared herself Queen of Castile. But it wasn't straightforward. A war of succession broke out as some supported Juana, Henry's daughter. Isabella and Ferdinand fought together, and by 1479, Isabella's claim to Castile was secure. That same year, Ferdinand became King of Aragon. So now you had Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon. They ruled their own kingdoms separately, but worked very closely together. Their motto was, Tanto monta monta, tanto Isabel come Fernando, meaning they amount to the same Isabella as Ferdinand. This showed their idea of an equal partnership, though, in practice, Isabella often held more direct authority in Castile, which was larger and wealthier. One of their biggest shared goals was to complete the Reconquista, the centuries-long effort by Christian kingdoms to retake territories in the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. The last remaining Muslim kingdom was Granada in the south. Isabella was deeply involved in the Granada War, 1482 to 1492. She wasn't just sitting in a palace, she organized supplies, finances, and even appeared near the front lines to boost morale. She was known for her piety and her determination. In 1492, Granada finally surrendered. This was a massive event, marking the end of the Reconquista. The year 1492 was a big one for Isabella, for another reason. For years, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus had been trying to get someone to fund his voyage west across the Atlantic, hoping to find a new route to the Indies. Many thought he was crazy. He'd been turned down by Portugal and initially by Isabella and Ferdinand too. But after the fall of Granada, Isabella agreed to support him. She saw the potential for wealth, spreading Christianity, and increasing Spain's prestige. So, with ships and funding largely backed by Castile, Columbus set sail and landed in the Americas. This, of course, had enormous, world-altering consequences. Also in 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand issued the Alhambra Decree, which ordered the expulsion of Jews from Spain unless they converted to Catholicism. This was part of their policy to create a religiously unified kingdom. Earlier, in 1478, they had established the Spanish Inquisition, a church court designed to ensure the orthodoxy of recent converts, particularly those from Judaism and Islam. These decisions had profound and often tragic impacts on many people. Isabella was also a patron of learning and the arts. She collected books, supported scholars, and her court was a center of Renaissance culture. She made sure her own children, including Catherine of Aragon, who would later marry Henry VIII of England, received excellent educations. She made a lot of reforms within Castile, trying to strengthen royal authority, reduce the power of unruly nobles, and create a more efficient government. She was known for her strong will, her religious devotion, and her political skill. Isabella died in 1504. She had designated her daughter Joanna as her heir in Castile, but things got complicated because of Joanna's mental state and Ferdinand's ambitions. However, Isabella's reign had already laid the foundations for a unified Spain that would become a major global power in the 16th century. She was a queen who didn't just inherit a title. She actively shaped her kingdom and, through her decisions, the wider world. Number 7. The woman who wrote her way to a career and defended womankind. Imagine being a woman in the late 1300s and early 1400s, a time when most women, even noble ones, weren't really expected to be scholars or public intellectuals. Now imagine not just writing books but making a living from it and using your words to challenge popular ideas about women. That's what Christine de Pizan did. Christine was born in Venice, Italy, around 1364. Her father, Tommaso di Benvenuto da Pizzano, Thomas di Pisan, was a physician and astrologer. When Christine was a little girl, her dad got a prestigious job offer from King Charles V of France. So, the family packed up and moved to Paris. This was a lucky break for Christine. She grew up at the French royal court, which was a hub of learning and culture. Her father believed in educating his daughter, which was pretty progressive for the time. She had access to the king's amazing library and soaked up knowledge. She married a young royal secretary named Etienne du Castel when she was 15. They seem to have had a happy marriage and had 3 children. But then tragedy struck. King Charles V died, which meant less income for Christine's father. Then her father died. And then, worst of all, her husband Etienne died suddenly in an epidemic around 1390. Christine was only about 25, a widow with 3 young children and her mother to support. She was also dealing with lawsuits over her late husband's estate. It was a really tough spot. Most women in her situation might have remarried quickly or retired to a convent. Christine tried something different. She decided to become a professional writer. This was a huge deal. There weren't really any professional female writers in Europe at that time. Writing was mostly a male domain, often associated with the church or universities. But Christine was talented and determined. She started by writing poetry, often about love and loss, drawing on her own experiences of grief. Her poems became popular at court. She gained patrons, wealthy nobles, who would pay her to write for them. She carefully managed the production of her books, overseeing the scribes and illuminators to make sure the manuscripts were beautiful and accurate. As her reputation grew, Christine started writing about more serious subjects. One of the things that really bothered her was how women were portrayed in popular literature. Many famous male authors wrote works that depicted women as silly, deceitful, morally weak, or just generally inferior to men. One particularly famous and influential poem, The Romance of the Rose, was full of such ideas. Christine decided to fight back with her pen. Around 1401 to 1402, she jumped into a big literary debate called the Quarrel of the Rose. She wrote letters and treatises arguing against the misogynistic views in The Romance of the Rose and other texts. She defended women's character and intellect. Her most famous work on this theme is the Book of the City of Ladies, the Livre de la Cité des Dames, completed in 1405. In this groundbreaking book, Christine imagines building a symbolic city populated by famous and virtuous women from history, mythology, and the Bible. It's a powerful argument for the value of women and a refutation of common slanders against them. She followed it up with The Treasure of the City of Ladies, Le Trésor de la Cité des Dames, which was a kind of conduct book offering advice to women of all social classes on how to live virtuous and skillful lives. Christine didn't just write about women. She also wrote on politics, moral philosophy, and even military strategy. Her Book of Deeds of Arms and of Chivalry became a standard military manual. She wrote a biography of King Charles V, praising his wisdom and good governance. She was deeply concerned about the civil war and chaos that were tearing France apart during her later life, the Armagnac-Burgundian conflict, part of the 100 Years' War. Her last known poem, The Tale of Joan of Arc, Le Dîner de Jeanne d'Arc, written in 1429, celebrated Joan's victories and expressed hope for France's future. It's also the only positive contemporary piece about Joan written while Joan was still alive. Christine de Pizan supported herself and her family through her writing for over 3 decades. She produced a huge body of work, and her books were widely read and respected. She showed that a woman could be a serious intellectual and a successful author. She used her platform to argue for women's education and to challenge the negative stereotypes that were so common in her day. She truly carved out a new space for women in the world of letters. Number 6. When ordinary women became brewers, traders, and guild members. When we think of medieval power, we often think of queens and noblewomen. But what about everyday women in bustling medieval towns and cities? Did they have any power? Well, it turns out many of them found ways to wield economic influence and carve out a surprising degree of independence, especially as towns grew in the High Middle Ages, roughly 11th to 14th centuries. This wasn't about one single woman, but a broader shift for many. As trade and urban centers expanded, new opportunities opened up. While society was still very patriarchal, medieval town life often required everyone to pitch in. Women weren't just confined to the home. They were active participants in the urban economy. One of the most common ways women got involved was through family businesses. If a man was a baker, a butcher, a shoemaker, or a tailor, his wife often worked alongside him. She might manage the accounts, serve customers, or help with production. This was just part of life. And if her husband died, it was quite common for the widow to take over and continue running the business. This widow's right was recognized in many places. It made practical sense. She knew the trade, and it allowed her to support herself and her children. Some of these widows became very successful businesswomen in their own right. Certain trades became particularly associated with women. Brewing ale, for example, was often a female occupation, especially on a small scale. Many women, known as alewives or brewsters, brewed ale in their homes and sold it to their neighbors or in local markets. It was a way to supplement the family income. In some towns, women dominated the brewing trade. They'd hang an ale stake, a pole with a bush on the end, outside their door to show they had fresh ale for sale. Textile production was another huge area for female employment. Women were involved in all stages, from spinning wool and flax into thread, think of the word spinster, which originally just meant a woman who spins, to weaving cloth and making clothes. In some cities like Paris, women formed their own guilds for certain textile trades like silk making. These female guilds could set quality standards, regulate apprenticeships, and protect the interests of their members, just like male guilds did. This was a big deal, because guilds were powerful economic organizations in medieval towns. Women also worked as shopkeepers, food sellers in the marketplace, selling things like cheese, eggs, and poultry, domestic servants, laundresses, and midwives. While some of these jobs were low status and low paid, they provided women with an income and a degree of economic agency. Of course, it wasn't all rosy. Women's economic opportunities were still more limited than men's. They often earned less for the same work. In many guilds, women could only become full members as widows or daughters of existing masters, rather than in their own right from the start. And as time went on, particularly in the later Middle Ages, some male-dominated guilds started to try and push women out of certain trades to reduce competition. But for a significant period, especially during the economic boom of the High Middle Ages, urban women played a vital role in the economy. They weren't just passive figures. They were producers, sellers, managers, and taxpayers. Records from the time, like tax rolls and court documents, show women owning property, making contracts, and even taking people to court over business disputes. This economic activity gave many medieval townswomen a sphere of influence and a level of practical power that often goes unnoticed when we only focus on the big political players. They were, in their own way, shaping the economic life of their communities. Number 5. The Duchess, who became Queen of 2 countries and defied a king. Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages. Seriously, her life was like something out of an epic movie. She was born around 1122, or possibly 1124, into a very powerful and cultured family. Her grandfather was Duke William IX of Aquitaine, a famous troubadour poet and a bit of a rebel. Aquitaine, in southwestern France, was a huge and wealthy duchy, bigger and richer than the lands directly controlled by the King of France at the time. When Eleanor was about 15, her father, Duke William X, died. Suddenly this young woman became the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, inheriting vast lands and incredible wealth. This made her the most eligible bachelorette in Europe. Just a few months after her father's death, in 1137, she married Louis, the heir to the French throne. Days later, Louis's father died, and Eleanor became Queen of France. She was barely a teenager. Life at the French court in Paris was a bit of a culture shock for Eleanor. Aquitaine was known for its vibrant arts, scene, troubadours, and a more relaxed atmosphere. The northern French court was more pious and stern. Eleanor was high-spirited and intelligent, and some say she found Louis a bit too devout and boring. In 1147, Eleanor did something pretty unconventional for a queen. She accompanied her husband, King Louis VII, on the Second Crusade to the Holy Land. She even brought along her own vassals and attendants from Aquitaine. The crusade was a military disaster, and there were rumors and scandals surrounding Eleanor during this time. Some whispered she was too close to her uncle Raymond of Antioch. Her relationship with Louis, already strained, got worse. They didn't have a son, only 2 daughters, which was a big problem for a royal succession. After they returned to France, their marriage was clearly falling apart. In 1152, it was annulled on the grounds that they were too closely related, a common excuse for politically convenient divorces back then. Eleanor got her Duchy of Aquitaine back. This was huge. She was single again, and still incredibly powerful due to her lands. But she didn't stay single for long. Just 8 weeks after the annulment, Eleanor made a brilliant and audacious move. She married Henry Plantagenet, who was Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. He was 11 years younger than her, ambitious and energetic. And then in 1154, just 2 years after their marriage, Henry became king, Henry II of England. So now, Eleanor was Queen of England. Her territories, combined with Henry's, created a vast Angevin empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees Mountains in Spain. Eleanor and Henry had a stormy relationship, but also a productive one, at least initially. They had 8 children together, including 5 sons. 2 of those sons, Richard, the Lionheart, and John, would later become kings of England. Eleanor was actively involved in governing. She often acted as regent in England when Henry was away on the continent, or she would manage her own lands in Aquitaine. She was a patron of arts and literature, and her court was known for its promotion of courtly love ideals. But things soured dramatically between Eleanor and Henry. Henry was known for his temper and his infidelities. His affair with Rosamund Clifford was famous. Eleanor was no pushover. As their sons grew up, they started to rebel against their father, wanting more power and land for themselves. And Eleanor, perhaps feeling marginalized by Henry, took their side. In 1173, she actively supported her sons, Henry the young king, Richard and Geoffrey, in a major revolt against King Henry II. This was a massive power play, a queen and her sons rising up against the king. The revolt ultimately failed. Henry II defeated his sons, and in a shocking move, he imprisoned Eleanor. She remained his prisoner, under various forms of house arrest, for about 16 years. Imagine a queen locked up by her own husband. Her situation changed when Henry II died in 1189. Their son, Richard I, the Lionheart, became king, and one of his first acts was to free Eleanor. She was now in her late 60s, an age when many people back then were considered elderly. But Eleanor was far from done. While Richard was off on the Third Crusade and later held captive in Germany, Eleanor, now the Queen Mother, played a crucial role in governing England. She helped raise the enormous ransom demanded for Richard's release. She secured his throne against the machinations of her youngest son, John, who tried to seize power. She was a formidable political force, even in her old age. After Richard's death in 1199, her son John became king. Eleanor continued to be active, undertaking diplomatic missions and helping to secure Aquitaine. She finally retired to Fontefraud Abbey in France, where she died in 1204 in her early 80s. She had outlived most of her children and many of her enemies. Eleanor of Aquitaine's life spanned most of the 12th century, and she was a central figure in the politics, culture, and power struggles of her time, wielding influence as a duchess, a queen of two different realms, a regent, and even a rebel. Number 4. The nun who talked to God, advised popes, and wrote bestsellers. In a small stone cell, a woman named Hildegard was having visions. Not just fleeting images, but intense, luminous experiences that she said came from God. This was Hildegard of Bingen. And she wasn't just any nun. She became one of the most influential women of the 12th century, a true polymath, a writer, composer, philosopher, mystic, visionary, medical writer, and abbess. Hildegard was born around 1098 in a noble family in what is now Germany. As was common for some noble children, especially if they were not the firstborn son, she was dedicated to the church at a young age. When she was about 8, she was enclosed with an older holy woman named Jutta von Sponheim at a Benedictine monastery. Enclosed meant they lived in a small annex, a kind of hermitage, attached to the male monastery of Disibodenberg. Hildegard learned to read Latin, studied the scriptures, and lived a life of prayer and work. She said she'd been having visions since she was a small child, but was afraid to talk about them. When Jutta died in 1136, Hildegard, then in her late 30s, was unanimously elected as the magistra, or leader, of the female community. Around this time, when she was about 42, she had a particularly powerful vision. She described it as a fiery light that came from heaven and pierced her brain and heart. A voice commanded her to write what you see and hear. This was a turning point. Encouraged by her confessor, a monk named Volmar, and with the reluctant permission of her abbot, Hildegard began to write down her visions. This became her most famous work, Scivias, Know the Ways of the Lord. It took her about 10 years to complete. It's a complex theological work, describing her visions and their interpretations, covering topics from creation and redemption to the church and the end of times. It's illustrated with incredible vivid images based on her descriptions. Hildegard was worried about how her writings would be received. A woman claiming direct divine revelation. That could be dangerous. But she sent her work to Bernard of Clairvaux, a very influential churchman at the time. He was impressed. He championed her cause to Pope Eugenius III. The Pope read parts of Scivias and, around 1147 to 1148, gave it his official approval. This was massive. It validated Hildegard as a genuine visionary and gave her the authority to speak and write. With this papal blessing, Hildegard's fame grew. She wasn't just a quiet nun anymore. She became a public figure. As the community of nuns under her guidance grew larger, she decided they needed their own independent monastery. Around 1150, against considerable opposition from the monks at Disibodenberg, who didn't want to lose the prestige and income associated with the nuns, Hildegard moved her community to a new monastery she founded at Rupertsberg, near Bingen, on the Rhine River. Later, she founded a second daughter house at Ebingen. As abbess, she was a capable administrator and leader. Hildegard didn't stop with Scivias. She wrote two more major visionary theological works, the Book of Life's Merits and the Book of Divine Works. But her talents were incredibly diverse. She wrote extensively on natural history and medicine. Her works, Physica, Natural History, and Causae et Curae, Causes and Cures, describe hundreds of plants, animals, and stones, and their medicinal properties. These were based on a mix of folk knowledge, classical sources, and her own observations. And then there was her music. Hildegard composed an amazing body of liturgical music, hymns, antiphon sequences for her nuns to sing. Her compositions are unique, with soaring melodies and a wide vocal range. It's some of the earliest identifiable music by a female composer. She also wrote a morality play called Ordo Virtutum, Order of the Virtues, which is like an early opera complete with music. Perhaps most remarkably, Hildegard became a preacher and a correspondent with some of the most powerful people in Europe. She went on several preaching tours, speaking publicly in towns and monasteries along the Rhine and other rivers, something almost unheard of for a woman at that time. Her letters survive, and they show her giving advice and sometimes stern warnings to popes, emperors, like Frederick Barbarossa, kings, bishops, and abbots. They wrote to her, seeking her counsel, because they believed she had a direct line to God. She even invented her own secret language, the lingua ignota, with its own alphabet, which she apparently used for mystical purposes within her community. Hildegard was a woman of incredible energy, intellect, and courage. She faced opposition and illness. She suffered from debilitating migraines and sickness throughout her life, which some scholars think might have been connected to her visions. But she persevered. When she died in 1179 in her early 80s, she left behind an extraordinary legacy. She had used her divine authority, granted by her visions and endorsed by the Church, to step far beyond the traditional roles for medieval women, becoming a respected teacher, leader, and public voice. In 2012, Pope Benedict XVI named her a Doctor of the Church, a rare title given to saints whose writings are considered of universal importance. Number 3, the Queen who fought her own husbands and sons for her crown. Meet Ulrica of Leon and Castile. She was born in 1079, the daughter of King Alfonso VI, a powerful ruler who had united the kingdoms of Leon, Castile, and Galicia in what is now Spain. Urraca was his eldest, and importantly, his only surviving legitimate child. This put her in a unique position. In the medieval world, female succession was tricky. Kings usually wanted sons to inherit. But Alfonso VI, perhaps seeing Urraca's strength, or lacking other options, eventually designated her as his heir. To prepare her, he married her off in her youth to Raymond of Burgundy, a French nobleman. They had a son, Alfonso Raymondez, the future Alfonso VII. So far, so good for a potential queen consort and mother of a king. But things took a sharp turn. Urraca's husband, Raymond, died in 1107. Then her father, Alfonso VI, died in 1109. Suddenly, Urraca, now a widow in her late 20s, became the ruling Queen of Leon and Castile in her own right. This was a huge deal. While there had been powerful queen regents before, Urraca was one of the very first women in European history to inherit a major kingdom as queen regnant, meaning she was the monarch, not just ruling for a son. Her father, on his deathbed, had arranged for Urraca to marry Alfonso, the first of Aragon, known as the Battler. The idea was to unite their Christian kingdoms against the Almoravids, Muslim rulers who controlled much of southern Spain. It sounded good on paper. Two Alfonsos, Urraca, in the middle. What could go wrong? Well, pretty much everything. The marriage, which took place in 1109, was a disaster. Urraca and Alfonso the Battler had clashing personalities. He was a warrior king, focused on military campaigns. She was determined to rule her own kingdoms and not be just a figurehead wife. The nobles of Leon and Castile weren't keen on an Aragonese king calling the shots either. And critically, Urraca and Alfonso the Battler quickly grew to despise each other. There were reports of him being abusive. So what did Urraca do? She didn't just sit back. She began to actively oppose her own husband. This led to open warfare between Urraca's supporters in Leon and Castile and Alfonso the Battler's forces from Aragon. It was incredibly messy. She was fighting for her own authority, her own crown, against a man who was supposed to be her partner. There were factions everywhere. Some nobles supported Urraca. Some supported Alfonso the Battler. Some supported Urraca's young son from her first marriage, Alfonso Raimundez, seeing him as the rightful heir and a way to get rid of the Aragonese king. Even Urraca's own half-sister Teresa, who ruled Portugal, got involved in the conflicts. It was a free-for-all. Urraca showed herself to be a resilient and determined leader. She led troops, negotiated alliances, and played the political game with skill, even when faced with betrayals. She had to deal with rebellions from her own nobles, incursions from her husband, and the ambitions of her son's supporters. There were sieges, battles, and constantly shifting loyalties. At times, she was captured or forced to concede territory, but she always found a way to bounce back. The marriage to Alfonso the Battler was so bad that Urraca sought an annulment from the Pope. It was eventually granted around 1114 on the grounds of consanguinity. They were distant cousins. But even after the annulment, Alfonso the Battler didn't just pack up and leave. He continued to interfere in Castilian and Leonese affairs for years. Urraca also had a complicated relationship with her son, Alfonso Raimundez. As he grew older, he became a focus for nobles who wanted a male ruler. While Urraca clearly wanted to protect his inheritance, she also wasn't ready to give up her own power. There were periods when she co-ruled with him, and periods when they were in conflict. She also had a long-term relationship with a nobleman, Count Pedro González de Lara, with whom she had 2 illegitimate children. This was scandalous to some, but it also shows her asserting her personal life in a way that male rulers often did without much comment. Throughout her 17-year reign, Urraca was constantly fighting to maintain her authority and the integrity of her kingdoms. She faced challenges that few male rulers ever had to deal with, primarily the assumption that a woman couldn't or shouldn't rule alone. Her entire reign was a testament to her refusal to accept that. Heracca died in 1126, still queen. Her son, Alfonso VII, succeeded her and went on to become a powerful emperor. While her reign was turbulent, the fact that she managed to hold onto her crowns for so long against such incredible odds, fighting foreign invaders, rebellious nobles, her own husband, and sometimes even her own son, is pretty remarkable. She proved that a woman could, indeed, rule. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't peaceful, but she did it. Number 2. The actress who became an empress and saved an empire. Imagine this. You're an actress, maybe even a dancer or a performer in something like a circus. Professions that in the 6th century Byzantine Empire were considered pretty scandalous, definitely not high society. Then you catch the eye of the heir to the imperial throne. He falls madly in love with you, changes the law so he can marry you, and then you become empress. Sounds like a fairy tale, or maybe a very dramatic play. But for Theodora, this was reality. Theodora was born around 500 AD. Her early life is a bit murky and mostly comes from a writer named Procopius, who really disliked her and Justinian, her husband. So his secret history is full of juicy, scandalous, and probably exaggerated stories. According to Procopius, Theodora's father was a bear keeper for the green chariot racing faction at the Hippodrome, the massive stadium, in Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine, Eastern Roman Empire. After her father died, her mother remarried, and Theodora and her sisters supposedly became actresses and performers. Procopius paints a picture of her as being involved in some very risque performances. Whether all the lurid details are true or not, it seems clear Theodora came from a humble and perhaps controversial background. Sometime in her 20s, she apparently had a religious conversion, gave up her old life, and became a wool spinner. It was around this time, or perhaps a bit earlier, that she met Justinian. He was the nephew and heir of Emperor Justin I. Justinian was completely smitten with Theodora. He made her his mistress. There was a big problem, though. A law prevented men of senatorial rank from marrying actresses. Justinian was way above senatorial rank. But he was determined. He convinced his uncle, Emperor Justin, to repeal the law. In 525 AD, Justinian and Theodora got married. When Emperor Justin died in 527 AD, Justinian became emperor, and Theodora was crowned Augusta, or empress, alongside him. She had gone from the lowest rungs of society to the very top. Now, as Empress Theodora wasn't just a pretty face or a quiet consort, she became an incredibly powerful and influential figure, a true partner to Justinian in ruling the vast empire. Justinian clearly respected her intelligence and judgment. He referred to her as his partner in my deliberations. She had her own court, her own officials, and her own imperial seal. She was involved in state affairs, legal reforms, and religious policy. One of the most famous stories about Theodora, the one that really shows her steel, happened in 532 AD during the Nika riots. These riots started as clashes between rival chariot racing fans, the Blues and the Greens, in the Hippodrome, but they quickly escalated into a massive uprising against Justinian's high taxes and perceived tyranny. Much of Constantinople was in flames. Senators, unhappy with Justinian, tried to use the chaos to overthrow him and crown a new emperor. Justinian and his advisors were terrified. They were holed up in the palace, and things looked hopeless. They were actually discussing fleeing the city by sea. Their ships were ready. This is where Theodora stepped in. According to Procopius, who, despite his dislike, couldn't ignore this moment, Theodora stood up and gave an incredible speech. She basically said that she would rather die an empress than live as a fugitive. She declared that royalty is a fine burial shroud, or, in some translations, purple makes a fine winding sheet, purple being the color of royalty. Her courage and determination shamed the men. She convinced Justinian and his generals to stay and fight. Inspired by her words, Justinian ordered his loyal generals, Belisarius and Mundus, to take action. They led troops into the Hippodrome, where the rioters were gathered, and ruthlessly suppressed the revolt. Tens of thousands of people were killed. It was brutal, but it saved Justinian's throne. And many credited Theodora's intervention with turning the tide. Beyond this dramatic event, Theodora had a lasting impact on imperial policy. She was a champion of the poor and downtrodden. She reportedly influenced laws that gave more rights to women, such as prohibiting forced prostitution, giving women more property rights, and making divorce laws slightly more favorable to them. She also established a convent for former prostitutes to help them find a new life. In terms of religion, Theodora had sympathies for Monophysitism, a Christian doctrine that differed from the Chalcedonian orthodoxy supported by Justinian and the official church. Monophysitism taught that Christ had only one divine nature, not two natures, divine and human. This was a huge theological debate at the time, causing deep divisions in the empire, especially in provinces like Egypt and Syria. While Justinian officially persecuted Monophysites, Theodora often used her influence to protect Monophysite leaders and moderate the persecutions. This was a tricky balancing act, but it showed her independent mind and her political skill in managing these sensitive religious issues. Theodora died in 548 AD, possibly from cancer. Justinian was devastated. He outlived her by nearly 20 years, but never remarried. He continued to honor her memory and her influence. Even Procopius, who tried to slander her, had to admit her extraordinary impact. From the stage to the throne, Theodora proved to be one of the most formidable empresses in Byzantine history. A woman who wasn't afraid to speak her mind, take risks, and shape the destiny of an empire. Number 1. The lady who built forts and fought Vikings like a king. Way back in the late 800s and early 900s, a time when England was not yet one unified kingdom and Viking raids were a terrifying reality, there was a woman named Aethelflæd. She wasn't just any noblewoman. She became a ruler, a military strategist, and a fortress builder who played a crucial role in fighting the Danes and laying the groundwork for a united England. They called her the Lady of the Mercians. Aethelflæd was born around 870 AD. Her dad was none other than Alfred the Great, the King of Wessex, famous for fighting off the Vikings and saving his kingdom. Her mother was Ealhswith, who might have had Mercian royal connections. Growing up, Aethelflæd would have seen firsthand the constant struggle against Viking incursions and the importance of strong leadership and defense. She was well educated, as was common for Alfred's children. In the late 880s, as part of Alfred's strategy to build alliances among the remaining English kingdoms against the Danes, Aethelflaed was married to Aethelred, the Ealdorman, or Lord of Mercia. Mercia was a large Anglo-Saxon kingdom in the Midlands of England, which had been severely weakened by Viking attacks, but was now allied with Wessex. This marriage was a political masterstroke, cementing the bond between Wessex and English Mercia, the western part of Mercia not under direct Viking control. Aethelred and Aethelflaed ruled Mercia together, acknowledging Alfred, and later his son Edward, Aethelflaed's brother, as their overlord. But Aethelflaed wasn't just a supportive wife. She was actively involved in governing. Charters from the time sometimes show her name alongside her husband's, or even acting independently. Around 902, her husband Aethelred's health started to decline. As he became more ill, Aethelflaed took on more and more responsibility for ruling Mercia. When Aethelred died in 911, Aethelflaed didn't step aside for a male relative or get married off again. Instead, she took full control. The Mercian people accepted her as their ruler, giving her the title Lady of the Mercians, Maerk ne Hafdij. This was highly unusual. Anglo-Saxon society was male-dominated, and women rarely held direct political and military power like this, especially not independently. What Aethelflaed did next was extraordinary. She continued, and expanded a program of building fortified towns, or burhs, across Mercia. This was a defensive strategy pioneered by her father, Alfred, in Wessex. These burhs were strongholds, safe havens for local populations, and bases for launching attacks against the Vikings. She built fortifications at places like Bridgenorth, Tamworth, Stafford, Warwick, Cherbury, and Runcorn. This created a network of defenses that helped secure Mercia's borders and push back against the Danes, who controlled areas to the north and east, the Danelaw. But Aethelflaed wasn't just about defense. She was also a skilled military leader who went on the offensive. She worked in close cooperation with her brother, Edward the Elder, who was now King of Wessex. Together, they launched coordinated campaigns to reconquer lands held by the Danes. While Edward attacked from the south, Aethelflaed would often lead her Mercian forces from the west and north. In 916, she sent an army into Wales to avenge the murder of a Mercian abbot. This campaign also resulted in the capture of the Welsh king's wife. In 917, a particularly important year, Aethelflaed's forces captured the key Danish stronghold of Derby. This was a major victory, one of the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw falling to the English. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a key historical source, records her military achievements with respect. By 918, Aethelflaed's power and reputation were so great that the people of Viking held York, one of the most important cities in northern England, actually offered her their submission. They pledged allegiance to her. This was incredible. A recognition of her strength and leadership by the Vikings themselves. It could have led to Mercia expanding its influence significantly northward. Sadly, before she could formally accept York's submission or consolidate this gain, Aethelflaed died suddenly at Tamworth on June 12, 918. She was probably in her late 40s. Her death was a blow to Mercia, and to the joint Anglo-Saxon efforts against the Danes. For a very brief time after her death, Aethelflaed's daughter, Elfwin, succeeded her as Lady of the Mercians. This was even more remarkable, a female succession from mother to daughter. However, it didn't last long. A few months later, King Edward of Wessex, Elfwin's uncle, intervened. He removed Elfwin from power and took direct control of Mercia, incorporating it into his Kingdom of Wessex. While Mercia lost its independence, Aethelflaed's achievements were undeniable. Her military campaigns and her program of building burhs had been vital in weakening Danish power in the Midlands and the north. She had protected her people, expanded her territory, and governed effectively for years. Her partnership with her brother Edward paved the way for their nephew, Aethelstan, Edward's son, who had actually been partly raised in Aethelflaed's Mercian court, to eventually become the first king of a truly united England. Aethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, stands out as a rare example of a woman in Anglo-Saxon England who wielded direct military and political authority. Not as a regent for a young son, but in her own right, leading armies and shaping the political map of the island.